found that 41% of working mothers said being a parent made it harder to advance in their career compared to 20% of working fathers. That gap is not a feelings gap, it is a structural gap. It is the gap between what was promised and what was built. For those of you who chose not to have children or who wanted to and could not, the promise exerted its own specific pressure. The question of children or career was supposed to have been retired. Your generation was supposed to be beyond that binary, and yet you found yourself answering it anyway, in interview rooms and at dinner tables, and in your own head at 2 a.m. when you were trying to figure out whether you had made the right choice or the right sacrifice, or both, or neither.
The binary was never retired, it was just moved underground. Let's talk about the exhaustion directly, because naming it matters. The kind of tired you are is not the tired that sleep fixes. You know this because you have tried sleep and it doesn't touch it. The kind of tired you feel is what sociologist Arlie Hochschild identified in her 1983 book, The Managed Heart, and extended in her 1989 book, The Second Shift. Hochschild documented what she called emotional labor, the work of managing your own feelings and the feelings of others as part of your professional and domestic roles. And she documented the double shift that working mothers specifically absorbed, the paid workday followed by the unpaid work of home management, caregiving, and emotional maintenance. But here's what needs to be added to the Hochschild framework for your cohort specifically, 4 decades after her initial research. You are not just doing the second shift, you are doing it while performing the version of womanhood that social media requires. You are doing it while managing the gap between what you were promised and what actually exists. And you are continuing to tell yourself, because the culture trained you to, that if you were just more organized, more rested, more intentional, more present, you could close that gap yourself. The exhaustion has a name. It is structural. It is not about you. Here is where the reframe has to be earned, not offered. Everything described above is real. The misaligned promise, the recession, the social media dissonance, the double shift, the identity ambivalence, the way the culture taught you to metabolize structural failures as personal ones. None of that was neutral. None of it was minor. You were handed an enormous amount to carry, and you were told the carrying was a choice, and you carried it anyway. But here is what psychology actually says about what that kind of sustained navigation builds. Psychologist Susan Cabasa at the University of Chicago developed the concept of psychological hardiness in her 1979 research published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. Hardiness, in Cabasa's framework, is not resilience in the sense of bouncing back. It is something more specific. It is the capacity to hold ambiguity without being destroyed by it, to be uncertain about outcomes and keep acting, to experience role conflict and contradiction without disintegrating. Cabasa identified 3 components: commitment, control, and challenge. The ability to find meaning in circumstances, even when those circumstances are not what you chose. Here is the thing about the women who grew up inside the broken promise of having it all, and navigated the recession, and built their identities across the analog to digital divide, and managed the second shift, and still showed up. They developed hardiness, not because someone gave it to them, because the conditions required it. This is not toxic positivity. This is not everything happens for a reason. This is the specific claim that the navigation of genuine structural difficulty builds something real, and what it built in you, if you are 38 and exhausted and still here and still trying, is a form of dual fluency that has no real precedent. Dual fluency is not a phrase from the existing literature. It is the best name for what you actually developed. You were fluent in the world that existed before the internet was social, before work was always available in your pocket, before every thought was potentially publishable. You remember what it felt like to be unreachable. You remember the texture of boredom before infinite content. You know what it is to have a private interior that nobody could access. That fluency is increasingly rare, and it is increasingly valuable, even if nobody has told you so.
And you were fluent in the new world. You learned it, you adapted, you built professional identities in digital environments, you managed your presentation, you learned to navigate workplaces that were using technology to extract more from you and calling it flexibility. Most people are fluent in one or the other. You were fluent in both, which means you can translate between the expectations of older colleagues and younger ones, between analog ways of thinking and digital ones, between the world that was and the world that is. This is not a consolation prize for what you lost. It is a genuine capacity that took 38 years to build and that most people will never have. There is one more thing that needs to be said before the close, and it is about the specific anger that might be underneath your exhaustion. If you feel angry at the promise, at the culture, at the institutions that didn't change fast enough, at the men who didn't do the second shift, at the women who told you it was possible without telling you what it would cost, that anger is not a character flaw. It is not bitterness. It is accurate perception. Accurate perception of injustice is not the same as being stuck in it. You can see a thing clearly and still move. You can name a thing honestly and still build. You can hold the anger and the gratitude simultaneously, because by now you know that holding contradictions is something you are specifically, demonstrably good at.
The anger is information. It is telling you where the gap was, where the promise failed, where you did not receive what was owed to you, and you adapted anyway, and the adaptation cost you something real. Let it be information. You don't have to perform your way out of it. Clinical psychologist Kristen Neff at the University of Texas has spent 2 decades researching self-compassion. Her foundational work, published in Self and Identity in 2003, defines it as treating yourself with the same kindness you would offer a close friend. But there is a specific application of Neff's framework that has particular relevance for your cohort. She distinguishes between self-compassion and self-pity. Self-pity is the belief that your suffering is unique and unfair, and that you are alone in it. Self-compassion is the recognition that suffering is part of human experience, and that your specific version of it deserves acknowledgement, and that acknowledgement is the first step towards something more solid. The women of your cohort were trained by the "you can have it all" culture, by the achievement messaging, by the social media infrastructure, to do neither. Not self-pity because that wasn't strong, and not self-compassion because that wasn't productive. You were trained to absorb, adapt, and move forward, to identify the gap and fill it with effort. What Neff's research